So we're so excited to bring this panel to life. The idea behind this was, well, I suppose the idea was here on the GOV.UK design system where I work, we have an accessibility specialist. And hey, accessibility is a very integral part of a lot of design systems around the world. There's probably other design systems that also have people working on accessibility. What if we got them all together to talk about the intersection between accessibility and design systems? So that's what we did. And yeah, it'll be a moderated chat, but we've got some space for like serendipitous conversation as well. If we can figure that out through Zoom, obviously interrupting people on Zoom is always a bit of a struggle, but yeah, we're gonna go with it, keep it a bit organic. During this conversation, you can ask questions at any time using the Q&A feature in Zoom. So that looks like two chat bubbles overlapped and it says Q&A. You should be able to also upvote in there different questions if there's one that you think specifically it deserves to be sort of asked to the group. And yeah, so we'll go at the end of it, last 15 minutes is Q&A. If you put any questions in the chat, unfortunately, we're not monitoring the chat from our side, so we won't be able to see those, but feel free to use the chat to sort of interact with the fellow people in the room as we go through this. And then the last thing to note is that we're ready to go. So if you're not here already, get in the room real quick because we're about to begin. All right, so today we've gathered these fine panelists, and I'm gonna go through and do a bio for each of them. So as I call their name, I'm gonna ask them to wave their hand so you know who we're talking about. First up, we have Anna Cook. Hi, Anna. So Anna's here from, I think, Boulder, Colorado today, if that's correct. And Anna has worked with several design systems and done design system teams over the years, and is currently working as a senior designer at Microsoft, focusing on accessibility and inclusion for Azure. Anna is also studying creative technology and design at the Atlas Institute of CU Boulder. And moving on, our next panelist to talk about is Michael. So feel free to wave your hand there. Yeah, so Michael is working on the design system over at NHS Digital. So I think the acronym there is National Health Service, and it's sort of the big healthcare body for the UK. So Michael works there, specializing in front-end development and web accessibility. Currently, Michael is focused on providing accessibility guidance, helping teams test with assistive technology, and helping set up an accessibility lab for NHS as well. Our next panelist we have is Phil. Hi, Phil. So Phil works closely with the design system team at Miro, and previously worked closely with the design system at Spotify as well. Phil is a longstanding expert in the field of human-computer interaction. He's got sort of 15 years of product experience across multiple different companies, and is currently the head of accessibility at Miro, where he's focusing on both accessibility and design systems, among other things. So next up, we have Shabana. Hi, Shabana. So yes, Shabana joins us from HMRC, which stands for, I've got it right here, His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, which is part of the UK government. At HMRC, Shabana is part of the design system working group there, and is an accessibility specialist focusing on assessing the accessibility and usability of HMRC services, raising awareness and providing support to teams, and advising on accessibility best practices. Next up, we have Sophie. Hi, Sophie. So Sophie is a software engineering team lead for the web core design system at the BBC, which is in Salford. Sophie speaks openly in both her work and personal life about her own experiences with chronic illness and disability. And that's sort of been a catalyst for Sophie and built the passion there for accessibility and embedding it into design systems. And last and definitely least, just kidding, last and about the same, I guess. I don't know where to place myself on this list, but it is me. Hi, my name is David. I work on the GOV.UK design system team as their accessibility specialist, and I've previously worked on the Ontario design system as well. I'm generally passionate about some of the more organizational parts of improving accessibility. So when it comes to like accessibility strategy, collaboration across different departments, and providing tools to teams so that teams using a design system can make their products more accessible as well. And I'm going to close the chat because that is totally going to distract me. Awesome. So we're ready to begin now. So we've got sort of a few questions to go through, and I'm going to pose them to the group, and then we're going to see if we can get some like organic conversation going. And if not, I'm happy to call on people as well. So the first question we have, big and philosophical, is how important is accessibility to a design system? And to start us off, I might go to Phil.
Hey there. So I'd just like to start off by kind of introducing what Miro is, first of all, and that kind of helps position, you know, what I'm going to say in the context of Miro as a product. So Miro is an online collaborative whiteboard that enables distributed teams to work together effectively. So there's brainstorming, digital sticky notes, and you can manage and plan agile workflows. And so we have a mission in the accessibility team is that we understand the teams include people of different backgrounds, experiences, and access needs. And so our goal is to give everyone an opportunity to collaborate. So whenever you ask how important is accessibility to a design system, I kind of believe that accessibility is part of the definition of a design system. So without accessibility, you don't even have a design system in the first place. So that's my position. That's where I'd like to kind of kick off the conversation.
Awesome. Yeah. Anyone want to follow on that?
Sure. So I think especially at the BBC, it's super important for our design system. And I think that design systems are kind of sources of truth for lots of patterns and guidance in areas of organizations or organizations as a whole. And it's really vital that we use that kind of like privileged centrality to apply accessibility as a requirement for things like contributions. Depending on how that works, that might be within your own team who are building the components, or contributors who are, distributed in doing that work. But yeah, really, really important that we embed accessibility in design systems, because we're kind of in a central point of privilege to be able to kind of do that. So.
All right, awesome. Next up, we have, drum roll, please. Maybe I'll pass it to Shabana.
Yeah. Yeah, so from my point of view, I would say, yeah, it's a fundamental consideration in every design system. Obviously, we're all concerned with accessibility, so we're all passionate about it and we feel strongly about embedding it. But I think we can all agree that accessibility benefits everyone. So it's not just saying, we're not just saying that it's going to target a particular user group, it's going to benefit everyone. A personal view I have is that a design system, a user of a design system kind of expects a certain level of expectation. You could even say trust that the design system is going to work across multiple platforms, technology. So I think it's the responsibility to make sure that it's accessible. And just one last little point that I wanted to make was that HMRC and maybe probably some of the other organization panelists on the organizations the panelists belong to have to meet it because for the law, so HMRC, we have to meet it to fulfill the public sector bodies' accessibility regulations, and so as not complying with accessibility, basically breaking the law. Yeah.
All right, awesome. I might follow on that with my little note there, which is very similar. Yeah, sort of how important is accessibility to a design system? One of the things about a design system that gets more into the weeds and is a little bit of a less fun part of it is that it needs to have value to an organization. And I think one of the places I've seen a lot of design systems, okay, I've seen like 2 or 3, but like one of the places I've seen design systems find that value is in being able to deliver components and different pieces that are accessible across an organization. Because accessibility is one of those things it's a team sport. It takes a lot of people working together and sort of passing from one group to another and continuing the practice of accessibility. So accessibility is like valuable to a design system as one of those levers of like why does the design system exist in the first place? Accessibility is one of those really great pieces to really say, like, this is why we have a design system, and this is why it's important. And I'll pass it to Michael for the final thought on this question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, with the NHS, a lot of the times we have to get sites up and running really quickly. So, for example, recently with the COVID pandemic, we had to get some sites up and running really, really quickly. And having a design system there, you know, it provides a really good sort of base to get some sites up and running quickly. But knowing that they are accessible saves us time and saves us money. You know, teams get this sort of base level of accessibility for free. So yeah, very important for the design system to be accessible, because as Shabana says, we are bound by accessibility regulations. So by law, we have to have our sites accessible.
All right, I'll give a little bit of space here in case anyone wants to add to anything that some of the other panelists have said here on this question.
I think it's worth pointing out that, and I think it gives a little bit of context for the UK specifically. I'm aware that we've got some folks that are not in the UK, but I did another talk recently where I pointed out that in the last family resources survey that was ran, 22% of the total UK population identify as having a disability. So for a lot of the public sector organisations, and there's quite a few, I think there's 3 of us here, like with a majority basically, well, 4. So yeah, it's really, really important that we reflect the people that we're serving, essentially, right, and make sure that everyone has equal access to those to the experiences that we provide. And a design system is, like, in my opinion, like the perfect place to start implementing that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I might also say, just as accessibility is important to a design system, it's also important to just every service that we run, especially as a government, but even as like private sector as well. So saying like, why is accessibility important to a design system is kind of missing the bigger picture. Accessibility is important in all of these spaces, especially web accessibility for a web space, but also physical accessibility for physical spaces, etc. So there's kind of a flaw in the question there of like, well, it's not just about design systems, it's important in all aspects. All right. And we'll move on to the next question based on the lull in the conversation there, which is sort of the converse of the first question, which is how important is a design system to improving accessibility in an organization? So we've talked about why accessibility is important to a design system, how are design systems important to improving accessibility? And I'll let someone go first. I won't choose this time.
I'll go ahead this time. I think when it comes to, and I'm sure I'm in good company on this panel, when it comes to improving accessibility across your organization, design systems really offer us the ability to fix and improve accessibility and scale outwards much more easily. The same way we can do that with any component or pattern. And so there's a lot, like if we didn't have design systems, we would end up with a bunch of different folks trying to fix the same problems over and over again, especially when it comes to accessible experiences. And so design systems are really good at empowering teams to have the tools they need, as well as having like the documentation they need, right? Because they can't, even with the most accessible component system, we need teams to understand how to use them and how to make sure that the implementation of those components and those patterns is accessible too. And so design systems do this really cool thing of balancing, you know, a wonderful out of the box, easy to use, ideally, accessible experience, while also helping to train folks and give them guidance in ways that we really need to be able to do.
Yeah, just picking up on that, yeah, in our documentation for, say, each of our components or a pattern, we have information about how to use it, but also there's a little section about accessibility. So there'll be a bit of information about what we've done, what testing we've done, and how we think it makes it more accessible. And hopefully this little bit of extra information that people see will get them thinking about it, and possibly a bit of increase of knowledge and interest in it as well.
Yeah, I would like to just to be very clear that I think absolutely accessibility is vital as part of a design system. But if you look at the other way around, it's really important to note that having accessibility as part of a design system is only one piece of the accessibility puzzle. So it's still possible to kind of have accessible components and then put those components together in a way that creates an accessible experience. I've seen that over and over again. So I think it's just really important to have those accessible blocks, but whenever you put things together, you really need to make sure holistically that the overall experience is accessible as well. So I think that's really important to note.
I'd like to come in, yes. So following on from Phil, yeah, having the components there is a great starting block, but then having those blocks there will free up the time that the teams then have to deal with more complex issues. And they can focus on that. So with regards to kind of more complex journeys, solve those issues rather than having to work with just working on basic building blocks. Yeah. So that was my point with regards to that. So in HMRC, we can kind of help teams with early engagement when they've kind of looked at, they've got the building blocks, but then building the more complex scenarios, we kind of help with them and then eliminate the accessibility issues so they don't kind of getting down further down into the build. We try to weave it out earlier.
Yeah, just really quickly building on what you just said there, Shabana, and also Anna, you talking about the documentation and the visibility, I think is the big thing, and so might touch on it a little bit later, but in the BBC's design system for web core, we have a tool that we built ourselves and then placed into our storybook. So we use storybook as the kind of Argos catalog, which the non-UK folks might not get, but of our components and containers and guidance and everything. And what we do in that is ask for accessibility UX documentation, acceptance criteria, and something we call a swarm. And that isn't meant to be perfect. We don't expect every team that contributes to the system to get everything right the first time. The whole point of it is to raise awareness of, hey, the design system expects you to document this. And then what that does is it raises the awareness and visibility of accessibility as something they should be including in their processes as a team. And then you get that like nice thing where they go, oh, yeah, we should be thinking about this. Where can we put this in our process to make sure that this isn't like something right at the end, right? That we're going to have to like do and try and get out the door before something goes live, for example. So I think that, yeah, that visibility of accessibility is a strong consideration, as something that your design system requires from contributors. It really helps spread that kind of attitude then throughout the rest of the organization, depending on how many folks use it. In our situation, our digital platform and the design system are like entwined. So if you're using the platform, you're using the design system. So we've got this really great place of privilege to encourage folks to think about that nice and early. Like Shabana, you said earlier on in the process, early engagement, collaboration between disciplines around accessibility. So really helps.
All right, maybe I'll pop in and yeah, just note, I think one of the things that maybe is a bit more of a practical piece is to say, if you have a design system in your organization, definitely use it to improve accessibility. Like, this isn't to say the only way to do accessibility is to build a design system in your organization. it's one of the easier ways, in my opinion. But you can definitely do accessibility with a design system. But if you have a design system, it has a lot of those different like organizational tools that help to improve accessibility. So use it basically. Like it has built-in ideas of like scale and consistency and like what do I use? I call it like an endorsed section of guidance, which is something that accessibility really benefits from across an organization. So just taking advantage of like if there is a design system to use that to improve accessibility, it's sort of a really good way to accelerate it. Even though, yeah, technically you don't need a design system to do accessibility, but if you have one, use that tool, like put it to good use and really accelerate. I think an example of sort of one of the side portions of a design system where I see accessibility being improved, and it's like, oh, that's interesting, is at least with the GOV.UK design system, we have a contribution model where folks who actually use the design system can contribute back to it. And we get like feedback from different groups that are actually building services with it. So in my opinion, one of the hard parts of accessibility is the sheer amount of testing that could be done and the research that could be done. And like all the advantages of doing research and testing. So by having it sort of flow through a design system, that feedback, we're able to sort of, I guess, compile research and accessibility research across a bunch of different services and a bunch of different teams, and then create like a central source of like taking that data and turning it into like design decisions and development decisions. So it's a great way to, yeah, sort of coordinate and collaborate on accessibility research as well across an organization. I will say it's not the only way to do that once again, but it is sort of one of those side benefits of like the tools that are built in to improve the design system can also be used to improve accessibility. All right, any last thoughts on this question? We're moving on then. All right. So the next question we have up is about structure, which is a very vague title, but I'll go into the real question now. So where has accessibility fit into the design system teams you've worked on? So this is more about anecdotes or like past experience. Where does the design system fit into the organization as a whole? So both accessibility within the design system teams you've seen, where does it go? And then the design system into the organization as a whole, where does it go? And maybe I will call on Sophie to go first.
How did I know that you were going to choose me? Cool. So I'm going to kind of answer backwards, if that's okay. So where does the design system fit into the organization as a whole? In the BBC, being public service, we have a limited pool of resource. And so there's a big drive in our organization to make sure that we're being efficient with license fee payer money, and that we're creating things that are efficient, reusable, and have value for multiple products and places, teams in the business. And I think that the design system is a great example of that, like working very, really well. It provides that, central point. There's one promo, there's one button, there's one, it's all there. Ours specifically isn't versioned either, so it really is one promo for all of the products on the digital estate, which is really cool. So yeah, where we fit in, I think, is part of that strategy, part of that, making sure that we're making the most out of the things that the product teams create, which is always amazing. So you want to make sure that it's visible to everyone, reusable. So that's really great. And then where has accessibility fit into the design system teams? So I personally have been a sort of volunteer accessibility lead in a couple of different departments in products, actually. So I started out in the sport department, and then when I moved over to WebCore, the reason I moved over was because it was this centralized platform, digital platform that was being created, and I figured that if I was going to implement accessibility properly, it would be great to do it in this central location, right, which would have an impact, a positive impact on every other product that builds experiences on the digital platform. So that's kind of why I moved over and where I figured that accessibility would fit in. And I've had tons of support from my management, and we've also got an amazing couple of like accessibility teams that have been in the organization, and that's changing a lot at the moment, so that we've got some new people coming in, and that's amazing. And you know, we've consulted with those folks and made sure that we're following kind of our own guidance. So we have the BBC Mobile Accessibility Guidelines, which is like it's like a nicer version of kind of WCAG with a bit more readability, if you will, specifically for the BBC. It's kind of tailored for us, because as a public service broadcaster, we kind of sit in a really interesting area in kind of the compliance space. So we try to go beyond compliance and be an example. So yeah, and the design system is a place where we've been able to kind of embed that accessibility culture in the org.
All right, awesome. I'm gonna say we're gonna shift gears on how we do this a bit. So feel free to, if you want to use the reactions portion, to raise your hand as a panelist, and then I can call on you that way. Otherwise, just before we do that, I'll put it out once again to like speak up if you have an answer to this question.
Yeah, so I can talk about you know, a couple of examples of, you know, where both accessibility and design systems has fit into an organization. So my role right now is as a product manager. So I manage both the design system and accessibility teams, and we have engineering teams on each side, and then we sit within what we call the core product team within the organization. So the team that's responsible for building the core of Miro. And that's really super helpful because, you know, we have joint meetings, I have lots of opportunities to persuade and to kind of, you know, socialize both accessibility and design system. Because what we find is that there's two kind of main customers that we have. Number one, we have internal kind of product managers, designers, and engineers for both design system and accessibility, where we need to, you know, persuade and influence around accessibility. And we also need to get adoption for the design system components that we build. So I think that's been really, really helpful to have that as part of our core product. The previous company, there was another part of the org. So it all depends on how your org is set up as well, right? So there was this other company had a platform organization, and where it was very clearly defined that the customers were, you know, internal engineers. And so they were building internal tooling and other, you know, kind of SDKs and ways of, you know, kind of making engineers more efficient. And that was a really nice fit for accessibility and design systems and other kind of things like localization. So I think, you know, it just really depends on how your organization is set up. But also, I think at a higher level, so accessibility, we have kind of three parts to how we're structuring it. One, compliance is really important, but sustainability is another piece. So, you know, it's fine doing a big audit once, but you need to kind of make sure that your engineers have the tooling and the knowledge and education that's required. And so I think that's why having more like a central accessibility and design system team can be very, very useful.
All right, awesome. Over to Anna.
I think the other speakers have really talked to the importance of, or rather how we can build some of the accessibility team structure within design systems. I do think there's something that it seems pervasive in most of the orgs I've seen, in that it's really hard to know like how we go beyond the design systems team, because as a starting point, it makes a lot of sense. And a lot of teams in earlier accessibility maturity models will start accessibility practice in design systems, which again makes a lot of sense. But for some orgs, you know, you have to have accessibility go beyond that, and to other teams and other parts of the organization. And so the tricky thing I think that I see is that, you know, we tend to see early maturity, it starts in design systems, but how do we go beyond that? And how do we build organizational accessibility across the board without it being all on like a few folks in a design systems team, because that's a lot of responsibility. Somebody on a design system may not know how to make PDFs more accessible, even though PDFs can be kind of intrinsically difficult and less accessible. So the expectations in terms of our organizational maturity, I think, tend to scale, and obviously they're going to depend on the organization as well. So I think I don't have the easy answer for what that looks like, but I do think there's a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? There have been questions and organizational nuances that I think are still being worked through across the board.
Awesome, yeah. So I'll go to Sophie, and then we'll move on to the next question after that.
Yeah, so it reminded me, Anna, what you were saying there about the fact that we do also have a Champions Network within the BBC, which does help quite a lot. Obviously, there's a challenge there in getting those kind of more expert skill sets, because you do tend to find that accessibility can appear very intimidating as a subject matter and as an area of technical expertise, especially. I think folks sometimes kind of look at the kind of morality attached to it, and the potential for them to maybe get it wrong and find that quite intimidating. So yeah, really important to have like the training in place if it's available, a community or sets of communities if you can organize those. So we have plenty of accessibility communities and guilds in the various products that are in the BBC, and that really also helps to raise that awareness and make it feel like it's something that you are, for lack of a better phrase, like allowed to work on. And that sounds silly, but I think, moving, I've just kind of been watching the chat a little bit, which I know David was like, ignore the chat, but I think it's really interesting. And like, moving from that reliance on individuals who are passionate themselves and moving to an organizational, putting it in the goals, putting it in the OKRs, but making sure that it's really coming from both the bottom and the top, and kind of meeting in the middle is super important. And we are seeing that shift. I believe, we're seeing it as a area of expertise that we hire people specifically for, because that depth of knowledge is, it's a deep subject, right? So, but yeah, I think the Champions Network stuff can really help with that, and guilds and communities makes a big difference. You can spread that knowledge around a little bit, which is what I've been part of personally. So it's good.
All right, awesome. Yes to all of that. And I'll move us on to the next question now. So the next one, the theme is communication. That's the general theme, and I'll read out the question. So what are ways you've seen design system teams keep accessibility considerations front and center during the transitions between design and development stages? So yeah, feel free to raise hands if you got sort of an answer to that. This question, you may not realize it. I think this was specifically written about something Anna had to say when we were chatting. So maybe I'll go directly to you, Anna, for your first answer there.
Well, that's good, because I was about ready to raise my hand and go, whew, I have a lot of thoughts on this one. I think in terms of documentation, I spoke on this recently, and there's a few folks in the design space, design accessibility and inclusive design space, who are working on this right now. You might be hearing the word annotations in some of these contexts. And right now there's a handful of different annotation kits that different teams are using. Some of them are publicly accessible. So one of those is like Indeed. That's my personal publicly accessible favorite annotation kit. That there's like Twitter, we've got Microsoft, we've got, I think, a few other things. And so I'm seeing teams use accessibility annotations in design to document accessibility related information, specifically what cannot be communicated using just the visual design alone or the prototype design. That way that the designers, it's I think what makes it powerful, and this kind of annotation kit work that is developing right now is it gets designers to think about accessibility, and it's more of a practice than anything in getting them to communicate and making them kind of ask the questions that they have to ask in the design phase for us to really truly build inclusive components, patterns, products. And so right now I'm seeing a lot of that, and I'm not, you know, my opinion is I think the design tools we have themselves could do better in dividing these gaps instead of making us do like spec work, like redlining, so to speak. But I think, you know, it's a great starting point, and I'm very passionate about this because designers, you know, we need to fill that gap between designer knowledge and practice right now.
Awesome, yeah. So yeah, once again to panelists, raise your hand if you have an answer. I'll pop in now with one that is a little bit of a cheat to say transitions between design and development stages, the way that we currently have it on the GOV.UK design system team. My opinion is we don't really have those transitions as a smooth process. So what we have right now is we'll have epics, as we call them, for each of the different components we're working on. And then in that epic, we're trying out a new thing where we have like a lead on that who will sort of coordinate among the team members that need to be involved. But in a lot of meetings, there will be like a designer and a developer in the same space together from the start, or even a researcher or the accessibility specialist if there's like a nitty-gritty question that comes up. So it's sort of like everyone on the team sport, once again, accessibility, everyone on the team is thinking about accessibility. So yeah, the like transitions between are very muddy. So I wrote this question, but I actually don't have a proper answer to it because we don't really have the traditional like handoff portions, which I think works in our favor, but it does mean that that person leading does need to have like a very strong control on like, okay, what needs to happen next for this this piece of work. I'll move over to Michael now.
Yeah, just following up on that, actually, in terms of physical space, we would all actually be in the same room, believe it or not, the designers and the developers. So we would have, you know, machines there, and designers would be showing designs, and we'd have for example, screen readers open, and we would just physically work together and show people, you know, show each other how things are working. So yeah, in the physical space, we were in the good old days.
Awesome. Yeah. And over to Phil.
Yeah, that kind of ties nicely into like, there's two kind of approaches to this I've seen. And the first is like, it's really, really important to build empathy among, you know, kind of designers and engineers. And, you know, the absolute, in my experience, best way to do that is to involve people with disabilities as part of your user research practice, and make sure that you encourage people to attend those sessions, because it's really, really difficult to observe someone struggling to use your product and then not actually do anything about it. So I think that's one, and that's a more softer kind of approach to really raise the visibility and really encourage people to engage you know, with people with disabilities as they're using your product. But the second thing that we do more at Miro as well is that we have a very tight integration with our product development lifecycle. So number one, we have an accessibility policy that mandates that we must create products that are accessible according to WCAG 2.1 AA. But then it's really important then to outline a process by which people can go about ensuring that the products they do create are accessible. And so what we did, we created non-functional requirements that have the same level of priority as security or privacy or any other enterprise requirements, because, you know, no one's ever going to release a piece of software that's going to expose all the user data. It's just it's a non-functional requirement. It's a mandatory before you release, and it should be the same with accessibility. You shouldn't be able to release something that's not accessible. So we identify, you know, at the very kickoff of a project, you know, a product manager must be aware of what are the requirements that they're going to encounter as they kind of go through the process. At the design stage, designers must be aware of, you know, how to annotate, as Anna said, be familiar with, you know, how people engage with their product and know how to annotate and know how to hand off to the engineers. And then engineers have unit tests, they have end-to-end tests, and they have ways of evaluating what they do. And the design system is kind of as an enabler for that process. And I think that's really, really important. You know, so you have empathy on one side, but you also have a very clear mandatory process along with a very clear outline for how people can achieve what you want throughout the whole process.
All right, awesome. Thank you. We're gonna move on to the next question we have here now. So get ready with those hands again. And this one is on the theme of documentation. So what's one method you've seen for documenting accessibility related information? And then just additional things. So like what type of info was it for and was it successful? And maybe I'll hop over to Sophie first.
Yeah, really, really great questions, because documentation is a huge part of the accessibility process in our design system. So like I mentioned earlier, we created this tool that we've called component health, that gives you kind of like an indicator that's really visible on whether you've put the right documentation in the right places, so that other people can come along in 2 years' time, see the current state of accessibility on your experience, component, container, whatever it might be, and understand what existing issues there are, if there are any, why they weren't fixed then, was there any blockers and all that kind of stuff. So the two main things that we use to do that are UX accessibility documentation, which encourages our kind of designers and developers to have a really early conversation. And I've got a really nice anecdote actually about this, so that relates to the design system itself. So not too long ago, we had a team that was creating a brand new component, and they were like, oh, we have to do accessibility documentation. Great, let's go ahead and do that. And their designers and developers had a conversation about the semantic structure of that component and how that might work. And what it actually did is it made them realize really early in the process that what they were creating needed to be different fundamentally in order to fit into the design system properly. So it wasn't even just the accessibility that they were thinking about, and that it made them think about to do that documentation. It was also, how reusable is this? Is this too similar in semantics to another component actually that does something very similar, even if visually they look very similar? Are they actually different, or vice versa? Is it just really the visuals here that is different, and is the fundamental underlying structure and user journey quite similar? So it's really, really interesting to see that collaboration happening, which kind of goes back to that previous question a little bit, is that it really encourages that communication nice and early, and points out not just accessibility issues, but also just kind of, how should this actually behave, and allows engineers to point out, what, that might be, that design there might be a little unrealistic, maybe we should try and do it a slightly different way, or here's how the semantics might look for that. So that's great. And the other thing that we do is one of the big pieces is the swarm. So that is actually very similar to what Phil mentioned, getting everyone in the team, so regardless of discipline, together when a component or experience has been created, and get everyone going through the UX documentation, looking back at the things that they've already created, the artifacts there, making sure it behaves as we expect, allowing folks to have a go with voiceover and JAWS and I kind of Zoom text and all these kind of like various modes of access and assistive technology. Now, we're not expecting people in that context to be experts, because they're not, and that's fine. But it does raise that kind of awareness again, and it allows us to have this living documentation. So the next time someone comes and looks at that component, they see the swarm linked in the component health there, and they can go and say, have a look at that and go, oh, we've got some things in here, some notes. And then just finally, one of the big things that allows us also to do is create a distinction between the baseline. So, we're under a lot of pressure to get an elections page out in the next couple of weeks, and there's an issue here. How do we know we've done enough for that deadline? And then what good looks like. So we have what we call accessibility P1s, or priority ones, which is high risk of exclusion. So we don't want to exclude any particular groups of people using any modes of access or assistive technologies, or with particular impairments that we would otherwise like to support. And then we have accessibility P2s and P3s, which are, it's accessible technically, but it's not an equitable experience. And equity is what we're looking for in our experiences as much as possible. So it gives you a bit of a distinction, and then allows you to prioritize the issues that come out of those swarms, and lets other people know, where that's at, and at what stage we are in fixing things, on improving those experiences, which is super useful. Thanks.
Awesome, yeah. All right. So looking at the time we have, for people who are going into the Q&A, we're going to start that very soon. So add your questions. Anyone in the audience, feel free to add a thumbs up to Q&A questions, and we'll use that to prioritize. So I'll head to Shabana though with a last thought on this, and then we'll move into Q&A.
Yep, so I was kind of going to go through a totally different format that we use to kind of educate our teams. So I'm an accessibility auditor, and what we've done is with the audits that we carry out in-house, we've been recording these on a GitHub repository. So what we've now done is we did a body of work where we decided what we want out of these issues. Not only are we giving these to the teams to kind of obviously resolve their issues in their services, but what we use with the issues is now we've categorized them. So if an issue was determined using an assistive technology, we label it as an issue with a screen reader or an issue with maybe high contrast, and we categorize it. Is it relating to a particular pattern or component in our design system? So we've got all of this great data that we've accumulated over the years, and what we're now doing with that is we've created kind of a statistic site to then educate the teams that these are the common issues that we're seeing. So we've got like the top WCAG violations that we're now kind of coming out with, that we hope that we can then target teams to kind of resolve and eliminate. And again, with design patterns and components that teams have used, but they've not used them quite as correctly. So they've raised issue concerns. So we've kind of turned around, the kind of the data we collect and used it in that manner to kind of educate and create that as like a documentation for people to use.
All right, yeah, sounds excellent, actually. So at this point, I think there's a lot more we could talk about this, see if we have like really rapid fire on the last question we had there, but I'll move on to Q&A now. Looking at the Q&A, I've sort of curated a first question based on the most voted one. So this won't exactly match what you see in the Q&A, but yeah, so first question is, how do you persuade accessibility experts to see past like a single component design and think about the bigger picture of the guidance and sort of the design system, especially if they're focused on passing legal requirements? So sort of how do you go from like making sure like an individual component passes to how components fit together as a whole, to avoid sort of accidentally making really shouty layouts where every component is like big and bold and loud. Yeah, that is sort of the way I summarize that question. And we'll start with Sophie and go from there.
I'll try not to be too verbose, but I think what I mentioned earlier about risk of exclusion is a really nice way to balance priorities when you're creating accessible experiences. So I've had this example quite a few times where we've maybe had someone say, hey, that bit of that experience isn't amazing for screen reader users, for example, but you might have a push and pull there between different modes of access, right? So for example, someone using a Braille display may prefer a shorthand date because it's smaller and you can kind of read it in one line, whereas someone using a kind of text to speech like a screen reader might prefer a long form date format so that's unambiguous. So that kind of situation, we take kind of those not conflicting, but kind of like the push and pull there of experience, and we ask who's at the most risk of being excluded in this scenario for all of those groups that we'd like to support. And we make sure that we're not accidentally excluding one of those groups in order to make an experience better for another. And that can be really, really tough to kind of decide between. But yeah, using risk of exclusion as the baseline really helps to, if you ask that question, like who in those competing groups of user needs is at most risk of being excluded here from accessing the content, it helps you to frame that kind of discussion a little bit more accurately, so that you can make a good decision.
All right, awesome. We'll go to Phil, and then we'll finish this question with Anna.
Yeah, just a very small point. And I think like it's really important to consider personalization of experiences. And by that, I don't mean, create a separate mode for screen reader users. But for example, if you look at, being able to change the background color is really important. People with astigmatism find it really difficult to read, say, white text on a black background. But then there might be other people who might prefer that opportunity. And so I think it's just, as you're looking at your product overall, look at ways in which you could potentially offer different options. I know this is Apple and do this really well, for example, with their built-in iOS settings, for example. Reduce motion is another really great example of where some people might prefer animations to help them. Other people might find that distracting. So I think just try and carefully consider that as an approach.
All right, and Anna.
I think I have two small points on this one. I think as Sophie touched on, what's most important, right, is we consider who is most affected by a barrier. And what tends to happen, right, is when we consider that person, that need actually, when we acknowledge it, also helps other users. So for example, when a page is screen reader accessible, it's also going to work with my narrator in Windows Edge. And I use that all the time. I'm dyslexic. And so it's also important to keep in mind that while some of that may feel very compliance focused, those needs do tend to actually affect a lot of folks in a positive way. That said, there are situations where, it can feel like, oh, we got to choose between one or the other. And I think, Phil touched on this as well. There's a lot of power in adaptability. And so, creating the ability in your sites and systems to support user preferences and the interest or like the ways that they want to use the experience is really valuable to help make sure that all those needs are met as best as possible. So it's not always a matter of one versus the other. It's just a matter of how can we try to do both without everybody working too hard. The user working too hard, rather. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, my quippy line will be: when in doubt, test with users, and specifically test with people that use those assistive technologies, or specifically with disabled people. The original comment had a note about how like shouty designs can be very difficult for people with cognitive disabilities often, which sometimes don't get as much attention from things like the regulations. And yeah, I think testing, building actual services that are like real and not just a bunch of components in out of context is pretty important to like seeing the bigger picture and helping accessibility experts get out of, because we can all get there where we're all focused on just like this button itself has to be perfect. And then you realize this button in the context of a service doesn't make any sense anymore. So always, yeah, I think testing is sort of like the get out of jail free card a lot of time, or get out of jail with a lot of effort. It's not free, but it's very valuable. The next question we have here is, how do we help to shift general attitudes towards accessibility beyond just complying to WCAG? So WCAG is the, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is sort of an international sort of agreed upon set of ideas for how to make things accessible on the web. Anyone have an answer to that? Go for it, Michael.
Yeah, I think it was mentioned earlier, but creating or increasing empathy might help. So at the moment at the NHS, we're trying to get an accessibility lab up and running, which has sort of various bits of assistive technology software and also sort of simulation glasses for visual impairments, or we have these gloves that sort of simulate arthritis and things like that. And getting teams in and just experiencing those sort of impairments definitely helps. And I think it creates a bit more empathy, and then they'll sort of think about the things that they're building, and hopefully they'll sort of keep that in mind when they're building and designing stuff.
All right, and we'll go to Phil.
Yeah, just to build on that, I kind of see WCAG as kind of like the first line of defense almost for accessibility. So it's important that you kind of do things like ensure images have alt text, things are keyboard accessible, but WCAG doesn't tell you anything about how to make your product usable for people with disabilities. And so I think really making sure that you involve people with disabilities in your process is really, really critical. And there are studies that you can look up. Helen Petrie, for example, improving usability and accessibility, compared like usability with WCAG, and they found that, you know, there were issues that were found through usability study that weren't found with WCAG. So I think WCAG is absolutely the first step. It's really important to do that, but it's also important to extend that even further.
All right. Unfortunately, looking at the time, we're getting very close. We're at 2 minutes. So I'm going to do sort of a rapid fire of like last thoughts from everyone here on the panel. But if you don't have anything last to say, basically you can say any like very quick thing, but if you don't have anything to say, our last theme was testing. And the question there is, where does accessibility testing and research enter the equation? So if you don't have anything else to say, that is sort of a free playground for a final thought. And I'll go to Sophie first.
Yeah, it was kind of around that last question, and I agree completely with Phil that we communicate as part of our design system guidance, and also just organizationally that kind of WCAG is the baseline, right? Like if you're not meeting that kind of AA standard, then there's probably some kind of fundamental things that you need to kind of relook at in your product space, and also that it's entirely possible for you to create a page that kind of, you know, passes all of those automated testing things that look through the WCAG checklistable items and it still be completely unusable. So communicating upwards specifically to your senior leadership, product managers, people who have that kind of like delivery responsibility, that meeting WCAG does not mean that your experience is accessible. That doesn't mean that you've like done, that you'd finished, if that makes sense. And letting them know that, you know, that doesn't mean that, like in the BBC's sense, that the audience is getting an equitable, amazing experience in the same way that someone with, you know, without an impairment, for example, might be getting. So I think that's really important to communicate. We do use automated testing, but it is very much a finger in the air, like it's probably going to catch the things that you should, that are kind of like the low-hanging fruit anyway, and it gives us a little more confidence, but we put a whole lot more into guidance and documentation and creating a community of accessibility within the products.
All right, I'll go to last thoughts from Shabana.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that, yeah, to ensure something that's accessibility, consider it throughout. Just don't leave it till the end. It should be throughout the process, and then, yeah, then we won't be excluding our users and making sure it's inclusive for everyone.
All right, awesome. I'll go to Phil next.
Yeah, just to kind of reiterate kind of our last point there, just the absolute gold standard for accessibility design system is to involve people with disabilities throughout the process. You know, nothing else you can do will have more impact, both from building empathy within your organization, giving you feedback and actionable things to do to improve your product. So that would just be my kind of final point, just to really stress, you know, there's so many tools that are available nowadays to help you recruit people with disabilities and to involve people. So, you know, there's really no excuse now not to. So yeah, that would be my final kind of plea.
All right, over to Anna.
I agree with Phil's point very much. And, you know, they say the phrase, nothing about us without us. And I think that it rings true. There's, I'll try not to hit it over the head too much. I think, you know, if you're looking for examples of a good design system documentation and accessibility, if you're looking for prototyping tools that are more accessible by default, look at the UK Gov. They did not pay me to say that. They do a really good job of it. And I think the prototyping capability itself, I wanted to call that out during the testing section, is a really nice way to build rapid prototypes that are accessible in ways that our existing design tools can't do. So I can't help it. I really just wanted to call that out. It's not more important than Phil's point. I think Phil's point rings true for this, like the biggest thing you could take away is that, but I'll add that as well.
All right, well, we're flattered, but thank you. And I'll pass it over to Michael now.
Yeah, just the final thing is I would encourage everybody to observe user research, especially with someone using your product. And if you see someone having difficulties with it, especially get like management involved, because if somebody can't use their product, then they're going to want to do something about it. So yeah, definitely observe, because you'll see stuff that's that you'd never thought of before.
All right. So that is the end of our panel. I think my last note will just be asterisks on all of this. You need funding in order to do a lot of the good accessibility work, and it's worth it. And a design system is a great place to do that because you can scale every dollar you put into accessibility across an organization. So yes, it will take some funding. Yes, it's very much worth it and will pay off for years to come. That's my last point. And also my last point is thank you to this wonderful panel. This was a pleasure to moderate. Y'all are amazing. I'm so excited we could get you all together in one space. And yeah, thank you to the audience for the great questions and for putting up with the graces that are a Zoom environment where not everything goes smoothly, but I think it went rather well. I'm going to hand off now to one of our organizers to take us through sort of the closing portion of the Design System Day event. But yes, round of applause for our panelists